go ahead and record this. So that, or if you want to, I don't know, for any reason you want to review it. All right. Now, things I want you to think about, okay? This discussion of the globalization of the Cold War, a lot of people look at the Cold War as exclusively or even predominantly a question of foreign policy. What I'm trying to get you to think about here is, yes, we're talking about globalization, but what I want you to be thinking about is, well, what was driving that? Why did the Cold War globalize? Did it have to? Was this inevitable? What were the forces driving it? And what I want you to think about is that anytime you see a foreign policy, so-called, it's always informed by domestic concerns. So that's the first thing to make note of and consider, is what were the domestic pressures driving either side during the Cold War? Now, obviously, for our consumption, we have a lot more accurate information and reliable information about the domestic pressures within the United States, and then to a lesser degree within other Western countries, right? I would suggest that not only because of my already admitted limitations as a Sovietologist, just in terms of the reliability of source material and all that, we don't have, I would suggest, as accurate or reliable a record of what was going on in the Soviet Union. But we can draw some conclusions, and I'd like us to do a little bit of that today. And we're going to be looking at some of what McMahon covers in chapter 4. But what I'm primarily interested in doing today is, you can read the chapter. What I'm trying to do is say, when you read it, think about it in this context. All right. So here are some things to think about. With respect to the Cold War, one of the operative concerns from both sides, the Soviets and the United States, is what is sometimes called demonstration effect. Okay. Does anybody know what this notion of demonstration effect is when it comes to policies and things like that? In political terms, demonstration effect? What it is the idea that simply by doing what you do and appearing to be successful at it, you can demonstrate to others that this is a model they might want to consider adopting for their own interests, right? Now, when you read any of the supporting Cold War documents, right? And we're going to look at a few of those. All right, we're going to look at a little bit at NSC 20/4, and we're obviously going to look at NSC 68, and we're going to look at the long telegram. One of the things that I want you to think about is the way in which the authors of these documents do invoke, even though they're not thinking about it in this way, they invoke concerns about demonstration effect, either with respect to the inherent virtues of the United States and the American system and capitalism, although they very seldom use the C word, or the potential harm of the demonstration effect of the Soviet model. And so this is important because the Soviet model does demonstrate at this time, and we're talking here, remember, from about 1947, which is right about, we've talked about some of the things that happened, but this is leading up to the consolidation of what we can call the Truman Doctrine, which is formally 1948, right? Now, what again is the Truman Doctrine? Anybody? Truman Doctrine.
Any other countries from being having undue outside influence exerted upon them, but mostly to prevent communism from spreading into other places ripe for revolution.
Yeah, the thing that's interesting about that is that even though communism in that speech is not really specifically invoked, it's clear that this is what Truman intends. And it's not just outside influences, it's also armed minorities within. Right, which I know you're thinking it's the same, it's kind of the same, it was considered to be kind of the same thing, right? Oh, under the influence, right, of the Soviet model, you've radicalized and become a revolutionary insurgency. We're not going to back that. In fact, we're going to, as we did with Greece and Turkey, taking those over from Britain, right? We're going to stop that. Okay. Really remember that and think about that when we talk about what the justifications were that were invoked to Truman in these various national security memoranda, and also in the long telegram and the X article. What Kennan in particular is interested in and frames in a very interesting way, right? And you see this clearly in the long telegram, but you see it articulated because he has a chance to, expand the premise a little bit in the X article, where he's saying, look, we're not afraid of other ideas. In fact, we welcome them. We have so much confidence in the American system and the American, way of life and all that, that, we can handle that. But we are facing this kind of alien ideology, Soviet socialism or communism. And what we have to demonstrate, and what we're confident we can demonstrate, and he emphasized the word demonstrate, is the inherent virtue and advantage of our system over theirs. So what I'm trying to get you to think about is part of what this Cold War is about. It's a very long exercise in demonstration. Look at what we do compared to what they do. Clearly, you can see that ours is the superior way to do this. So a lot of this gets back to the notion at the end of the British Empire, the sort of collapse of the British Empire, that prestige was so much a part of that. What I'm suggesting is that in any imperial or hegemonic undertaking of any kind, and the Cold War was that, if nothing else, right? Prestige is instrumental. Prestige is kind of an important component of the soft power. And what I'm suggesting is a way to think of that prestige is in the context of this notion of demonstration effect. So what Kennan is suggesting is, look, we've shown and will continue to show the obvious and inherent virtues of our system. We have to do that because the alternative now in this increasingly bipolar world is the Soviet system. Here's the problem with the Soviet system, though, right? Inside of a generation, the Soviet Union has been transformed from essentially what would have been described as a backward country, right, into a fully industrialized society of, coffee achievers. I mean, it's like they've experienced these extraordinary, rapid transformations of their industrial capacity. Their ability to rebuild after the war has been demonstrated, or is being demonstrated as early as, let us say, 1947, 1948. And this after the shattering destruction of so much of the Soviet Union as a consequence of that war. And without, things like the Marshall Plan to bail it out. This is important because this notion of demonstration effect has extraordinary appeal to countries now emerging newly independent or aspiring to that in nationalist and insurgent movements to become independent, in the wake of the collapse of the European empires. And they're looking at the Soviet Union and they're saying, you know what? Our oppressors are now aligned with the United States and their model. But look what the Soviets have done. And look at how quickly they did it. Now, never mind that, how they did it also involved a tremendous amount of brutality against their own people and indifference to the suffering of others and a lot of other things. But you can't argue with a certain kind of materialist success that the Soviet Union at this period of time is demonstrating. And what's important is this is also invoked specifically in NSC 68. Okay, Nitze and his crew make sure that Truman understands. Look at their rates of industrialization. Look at the expansion of their productivity. Look at their ability to produce steel. Look at all these things. You know why? Because the rest of the world's looking at them. And we should be concerned about that. So this is what I'm suggesting is to think about, right? Is that part of the concern is this notion of demonstration. Are they demonstrating? Do they appear to be demonstrating, particularly to the emerging so-called developing world? You know what? We've got a better plan. We've got a better plan than the American plan, than the Western European plan. And it looks like this. And it's different. And it's going to emancipate, the people who were so obviously oppressed under the thumb of Western capitalism. It's going to liberate all of you. And we can look at that now with decades of hindsight. We can kind of snicker at it. But in the late 1940s and early 1950s, that was pretty intoxicating. If you were trying to mobilize people in an anti-colonial struggle or in the consolidation of a new national sense of purpose and everything as an emerging independent country, that could look pretty appealing. And as we've seen repeatedly, it was appealing as a rallying point for a number of leaders of emerging developing countries. Okay, are there any questions about that first perspective, this notion of demonstration effect? Does it make sense what I'm saying? And again, there are many ways we can look at the Cold War, as I think you're seeing. This is only one of them. Okay, so that's the first one. Okay, the second one would be from the point of view, say, of Britain. You know, where does Britain fit into the Cold War? Britain obviously is shattered by the war. Remember that I mentioned to you that about half of the economic recovery plan money went to one country. It went to Great Britain. That's a huge amount of money. And yet still Britain was struggling. Remember, because, right, we know that we get into 1947, in 1948, Britain still hasn't got it together. They can no longer afford to prop up right-wing governments in Greece and Turkey. They also can, you know, they've lost India. They've lost and they've lost and they've lost and they're continuing to lose. In other words, the sense of defeat from the Second World War is one that as an ally, they shouldn't experience, but they are. So for them, the dilemma of the Cold War is twofold, right? On the one hand, they have to acknowledge that the United States is helping them to rebuild, and that absent the United States, it would be very difficult for them to do that. On the other hand, there's a growing concern within Britain that they are becoming the aircraft carrier of the United States, that they're becoming a sort of forward military base for what many Brits are describing, particularly on the left, as a kind of new American imperialism. And they're not thrilled about that, okay? But you see how that's a domestic pressure. This is occurring within Great Britain, but it's going to have an influence on the diplomatic initiatives of Britain, and it's going also to have an influence on the alliance and the allied status between Britain and the United States. That's, I would argue, ongoing. That is still part of our relationship with the UK today, okay? So that's another important force that's shaping this globalization. Remember, too, another concern here of the, let's say, the mid to late 1940s is within Europe specifically. And it is, well, wait a minute, you know, yeah, we have to fear the Soviets, but we also have to fear Germany, right? Now, we talked about this last week. There was that concern. There was an initial alliance between France and Britain with respect not only to the USSR, but to Germany. What was the ultimate European resolution to that again further globalizes the Cold War? Something was generated out of that in an attempt to resolve that tension. Circa 1949.
NATO.
Now, why is NATO important in the context of the globalization of the Cold War? And the Truman Doctrine and a number of other things.
One of the major factors is that it allowed for the rearmament of West Germany, which was obviously a major goal of the United States and a major fear of pretty much everyone else. But it provided some assurances to France and England and the rest of Western Europe and Scandinavia that there was going to be some oversight as to how Germany's military could conduct itself once they had some weaponry back.
Right, and this is very important and very well summarized, because the idea is it was of concern to everyone else. It was of principal concern, you can argue, as much as it was a concern to France and England. It was a principal concern to the Soviet Union. They were terrified about this prospect. And this is why ultimately Germany remained divided. The idea was, okay, they're going to rearm, but we've got the other side. And we can use them as a countervailing, point of pressure against the West as part of our ongoing attempt to expand what's the best way to say this? A kind of protective shield of satellite states, right? Behind which we will now, for the first time in history, feel more or less secure on the Eurasian landmass, okay? Can't do that with a unified, militarized, and Western-leaning Germany. We can't do that. But by retaining East Germany, we have a greater likelihood that we can do that. And this is why you see that barrier harden, and you see the wall go up, and you see, you know, this increasingly institutionalized division of East and West Germany, right? This is that power struggle within Europe over these two emerging behemoths, you know, in the Cold War, right? And so then we have to think about the pressures internal to the United States. Again, it's striking that when you look at NSC 20/4, when you look at NSC 68, when the internal politics of the United States is invoked, it's almost in this kind of fairy tale ebullience. It's like, we're so free. We're just so free, and we're so wonderfully happy in our freedom and everything else. And if it weren't for these evil, you know, subterranean Soviets, like the whole world could be just as happy and free as we are. But in fact, we know that that's not what was going on in the United States. It's not at all what was going on in the United States. The reality is strikingly different. On the one hand, this is a period of tremendous optimism for the American people, right? There is a sense that, there's a sense that the war's over and the Depression's over. And for most Americans, they're seeing these unprecedented levels of prosperity. And we see this explosion of a comfortable, affluent middle class with these solid industrial jobs, you know, factory jobs and things like this that are well-paying and have pensions. And because again, what's important here? This newly found muscle of organized labor, right? One of the things that hasn't yet been mentioned with respect to McMahon's coverage, and this is why I wanted to talk about internal pressures. Right about the time of the Korean War, we have a major strike among steel workers. When you're trying to prosecute a war and your steel workers don't want to go to the mill, you've got a problem. So there are extraordinary internal pressures in the United States. That steelworkers strike was driven by elevated expectations coming out of the Second World War, coming out now having, you know, full employment and well-paid jobs and strong unions that can regulate safe workplaces and, you know, 8-hour days and 40-hour weeks and all the things that we all take for granted. Those had to be fought for, and I mean literally fought for physically. Okay, well now we have them, and the idea is, well, yeah, we got them, but it puts pressure on corporate America, on industrial America. How do we retain these tremendous levels of productivity? How do we continue not only to compete, but to dominate the world if our workers can from time to time slow that process down? Okay, this is a significant force of motivation, particularly for the Republican Party when it briefly achieves congressional control after the 46 elections, right? And this is something we got to remember, because the idea here is we want to cut back on that union power. We've never liked it. We hate it now. But also we can use this wedge of communism, right, to undermine the legitimacy of the labor effort by painting it pink, if not actually red, okay? So we can use this increasing fear of communism in order to rally the American people to push back on organized labor and to push back on and delegitimize some of the demands of labor, you know, as being, you know, the kinds of things that are going to compromise American freedom and American prosperity and all these things, and therefore are subversive of the American way. You see again and again and again, people invoking the American way here, right? That's very important. So you have this growing middle class, but you also have concerns by American elites that, you know what, we don't want to stop that middle class from growing. We don't know how comfortable we are giving their workers much more power. What is the one thing that is at the core of Soviet socialism, ideologically and rhetorically? The empowerment of industrial workers. Again, it's that concern about demonstration effect. We have to show that we have a better way of organizing and using and disciplining labor than the Soviet system, and that our way is more creative of profit and more creative of affluence and more creative of stability and order than the, you know, the police state, or increasingly, as it was referred to, the slave state of the Soviet Union. Okay, Are there any questions about that? You see where I'm going with this? In other words, we think about globalization, and the chapter rightly focuses on a number of sort of flashpoints globally, and we'll talk about those. But I think before we do, it's important that we remember, there was a lot going on inside these two behemoths, and we need to think about that as, when we look at this increasingly apocalyptic tone of a lot of the anti-communist advocates and elites within the American foreign policy establishment. We need to remember that's informed in part by concerns about what's going on within the United States, as well as between the United States and the rest of the world. Okay? All right. So then we get to this question of containment. And we talked last time about Kennan's long telegram. And to that, we could add, his authorship of the first of the significant NSC memorandums, the 20/4. That whole 20 series is authored largely by George Kennan, in which he's attempting to outline this policy of containment. Now, if you look at, and I would recommend that you do, if you have a specific interest in this, and particularly if you're looking for a broader research topic for your final assignment, just the development of containment as a policy is a wonderful area for research. And there are a number of ways to approach it. One of them, by the way, is through this notion of, recognizing internal pressures and finding ways to contain or dissipate those, in part by the way that you structure your foreign policy, which sounds a lot more complicated than it really is. That's part of what's going on with NSC 68. And we'll get there in a second. But this notion of containment, right? Now, we already talked about Kennan's observations about, what's going on in the Soviet Union. Remember, he's seeing this from the inside. He's still an outsider, but he's in the Soviet Union and he's observing this. And by way of review, what are some of the things that Kennan is seeing inside the Soviet Union that compel him to compose this very long and elaborate telegram? What does he say is going on? What's motivating the Soviet Union? What is the nature of the Soviet threat, first of all? So that this doesn't just become me harping on in front of a bunch of Zoom screens. This is review. This is stuff we talked about last week. I'm feeling oddly patient.
I mean, a lot of what he outlined in the long telegram goes right alongside what we were talking about today with the demonstration effect. Like, he was warning, I mean, obviously it's like the first stages of the theory of containment. So he's warning about not necessarily direct Soviet sponsored spread of communism, but that the fact that communism exists in the Soviet Union is a problem, and that in order to contain it there, we need to stick to what we do in America and prove that our way is better by making a larger show of it, essentially, is what it boils down to.
Well, that's part of it. I mean, in the long telegram, for example, is Kennan specific in saying the Soviet Union wants to rule the world?
No.
What is motivating the Soviet Union, according to Kennan, in the long telegram? And if you're blanking out on it, the text of the long telegram is linked to the Moodle page. You can actually kind of sneak a peek at it, and I won't even be able to tell.
They want to regain the regional hegemony that they had achieved under the Tsarist system.
Yeah, that's essentially it, that they want to secure their very vulnerable land borders from subsequent incursion and invasion, and that they want, insofar as is practicable, to reacquire, the old imperial possessions of the Tsars. That they want to reestablish themselves as a modern industrial global power. They aspire to that. Now, that doesn't in itself sound terribly sinister. right? But what's the problem? Part of the problem that Kennan points out is that, and remember, he's talking about from the viewpoint of the Soviet Union. They do not see the possibility of peaceful coexistence. He's trying to argue that the Soviet leadership, unlike the Soviet people, the Soviet leadership cannot envision a world in which the United States and Western capitalist countries can peacefully coexist with the Soviet Union and its satellites. The implication of that is that the Soviets themselves view war as inevitable. Okay, now he's saying that. He definitely says this in NSC 20/4, where he actually says it's clear that the aim of the Soviet Union is world domination. You know, this is interesting because this is a little bit of a departure from the more measured kind of language that he uses in the long telegram and in the X article, where he's not so much saying this is the focus of evil in the modern world. That doesn't come until Ronald Reagan, but as we see, yes, it does. It comes with Paul Nitze in NSC 68, right? But that's not what Kennan is not saying. Things like that kind of apocalyptic language. This is Satan, right? He's saying this is a country with a lot of grievances and a lot of insecurity and a tremendous amount of pride that wants to flex its muscle globally as a meaningful world power. But the thing that's interesting that really struck me as a graduate student when I first read these things is, and I'll try and give you the exact, let's see. Yeah, this is early on. And again, I didn't assign this, but I'm just throwing it in as you might want to think about this. If you want for your research to do something on NSC 68 or, containment or whatever. The communist ideology and Soviet behavior clearly demonstrate that the ultimate objective of the leaders of the USSR is the domination of the world, okay? Now, this is written in November of 1948. So a lot of time has passed since the long telegram and the X article, okay? So that's the first thing, is that initially what Kennan is saying is, the important thing here, as he frames it, is American leadership, in order to counter this inevitable effort by the Soviet Union to exert its muscle, is to adopt a patient but firm and vigilant containment, right? In order to blunt Soviet ambitions. That is, we need to find different ways of containing these impulses they have to expand outward and to flex their muscle. I'm sorry, Brett, do you have your hand up? Yes, you do.
Yeah. So this idea that communism and capitalism can't peacefully coexist, to me, kind of smells a lot like Stalin's paranoia, and however justified it may or may not have been given his rise to power in the Soviet Union, was it that kind of paranoia that led to the long-term held belief? So I guess that theory of communism and capitalism not being able to peacefully coexist, is that like inherently a communistical idea, or is it Stalinist?
Well, that's a great question, and it really kind of depends on how you read your Lenin and your Marx, not your Stalin, right? And the reason for that is that we have to remember, and Kennan's aware of this, there are within the Soviet leadership significant fractions, and we're going to see those emerge in the death of Stalin. Significant fractions between those who are essentially Leninists, right, who are sort of holdovers from the early revolutionary movement, one of whom, by the way, could be argued to be Khrushchev, and the Stalinists, right, who support and advocate, the cult of personality around Stalin as maximum ruler, and that kind of, as Brett refers to it, that kind of paranoid view of the rest of the world. But ideologically and dogmatically, the one thing that kind of unifies them is that as a program for the future, Soviet socialism must lead inevitably to the erosion and destruction of capitalism, not necessarily through warfare, but that this is, remember Marx, that this was looked at as an historical inevitability, that the contradictions of capitalism would allow for the ascension of socialism leading to communism, that it was presented, as sort of sometimes described as scientific socialism, right? Or historical materialism, whichever way you look at it, that history is driven by these material forces. The key to that, the means of production. The socialist means of production can't coexist in a single country with capitalism. Ultimately, the one will elbow out the other, if you are a Marxist or a Leninist, right? So Kennan's not wrong that, a lot of the leadership, and remember, we're talking about people who are in the party, but more importantly, in the party leadership. And what they're saying is, ultimately history's on our side, but how long do we wait before we kind of give history a nudge? That is another point of division within the Soviet leadership. How fast and how far can we move this great revolutionary experiment? But Kennan's right when he points out that programmatically, adherence to Soviet socialism can't really quite envision the more or less endless coexistence of capitalism and Soviet socialism or communism. It's an ideological premise, okay? And in a minute, we'll get to what the American version of that same kind of obstinance is. It's framed in the same way. Okay, but that's why what Kennan seems to be proposing is, we contain them, and in the meanwhile, we do everything we can to persuade the Soviet people to put pressure on that leadership, inspired by our superior example, our liberating and emancipating example, right? Which ultimately will reveal to the people of the Soviet Union and their wretched satellites the inherent flaws of their system and the superiority of the Western system of liberal democracy and freedom and capitalism and all that kind of stuff. They will then put pressure on that regime, in one way or another, it will be brought down. But what he's not talking about is direct military intervention. At no time does Kennan advocate that. Even when he's saying, okay, their ultimate aim is world dominion. He's not saying, therefore, we should have a massive stockpile of nuclear weapons and go and kick their asses. He's not saying that, ever. Kennan doesn't support the militarism that Eisenhower would describe upon his departure from office in 1961 as the military-industrial complex. Kennan is opposed to that. He's terrified by it. In part because it starts to smell something like the Soviet Union to him, and that concern that, in defeating your enemy, you become more like them, that kind of thing. Okay, so that's, the notion of, containment a la Kennan is that there is this Soviet conviction in the inability of the two systems to coexist. So what we need to do is be patient, right, but firm and vigilant. And we need to find ways of helping people to resist this pernicious spread of this system and its adherents, because it's dangerous to world stability, right? And that's the notion, the original notion of containment. Okay, now, by the time that we get to NSC 68, we're going from approximately mid to late 1946 through to 1950. There's a lot going on in the world. I mean, we have the more or less clear articulation of the Truman Doctrine in 1948. Okay, but there are other things going on as well. Kennan comes out with NSC 20/4, which is sharper, but not exactly bellicose, but it's certainly a sharper critique of the Soviet Union. We then have the so-called fall of China in 1949. Now, again, we talked about this last week, but why is that important? Remember, think not only globally, but in terms of the pressures on the Truman administration internally. This fall, or sometimes framed as the loss of China. Why is that important?
Because the Communist Party won?
Well, because the Communist Party won, so what? Explain to me why that's important to the United States, for example.
Yeah, that's really important to the United States because they're trying to contain, and I believe it was I can't remember which president it was, but he said that in Southeast Asia, that if China were to fall, it'd be very bad because it's going to spread to the rest of them.
Yeah, it starts with Truman.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. By the way, that sounded snarky, and I didn't mean that when I said "so what." I'm thinking it's the question we always must ask. So what?
No, you're good.
So what?
You're good.
Sorry about that. But that's right. Here we are saying we're containing communism. Next thing we know, where does it bust out? China. Oh, good. All of a sudden, Southeast Asia becomes more important than it already was. So hey, there's a small one. So a lot of people don't really understand, like, why did we go to Vietnam? We didn't have a lot of profound economic interests there. We didn't really have, a need geostrategically because that region of the world was of intrinsic importance or had all these tremendous raw materials. They talked about it, oh, the tin and the tungsten and all that. That's really not what it was about. It's what Johnny was talking about, though. It's that idea that, oh my God, we've got to contain communism. It just busted out. We've had it all contained, and then popped that membrane, and it came out where? It came out in China, this massive country that's been chronically unstable for a very long period of time, right? Is a casualty also of the Second World War and a power vacuum created by that war, but also the forces that the United States backed in that effort at, Johnny, what you described as containment in China, they failed. Chiang and the Kuomintang failed. They were inept and incompetent and corrupt. Everything the Soviet Union, sort of invokes in terms of the problems of capitalism was demonstrated by Chiang and the Kuomintang. And they failed, and they were routed and run out of the country and run off to an island. Okay, it was looked at as this tremendous failure, but also it was looked at as a failure of Truman's making through his inaction and his incompetence. And a lot of people even said traitorous actions and things like that. There was a lot of that sort of Trumpian hysteria at this period of time, about, you're a traitor. I mean, you must be, you're either a communist sympathizer or you're so incompetent as to be dangerous. But Republicans in particular, not surprising given the two dominant parties, were using this and saying, see, this is why we can't trust Democrats. And a lot of people argue that, this is one of the things that ultimately brought Eisenhower to power and gave Republicans control of the White House for 8 years was, Democrats demonstrated they can't manage communism. They can't do it. Okay. And so it's important, but also we fundamentally misread it, because this is where, even though early analysts understand this is not monolithic communism, in time, the United States foreign policy establishment would fall back on that mythic notion that wherever possible, communism is going to have, they're going to make common cause. It is functionally monolithic, which we know that it never was. It isn't now, and it never was. Okay. But this becomes important very soon after this. Okay. What happens then? NATO was created in 1949 at the same time that this is happening. Not only does it kind of resolve the problem of rearming Germany, but it gives the rest of the West this idea that, rather than allowing the United States to come in here unilaterally, which because of their domestic political pressures, they may not be willing to do, and also because we don't want them to be, the sole superpower, we've got this alliance now that means all of us are more secure than we were. And indeed, NATO has proven to be remarkably stabilizing in Europe, right? But in 1950, in June, what happens? Apropos communism in Asia, June 1950. Somebody I haven't heard from yet.
Korean War.
Yeah. Why is that Korean War important?
Well, it forces our military buildup ultimately, but for the multipolar bit of the communist argument that you were discussing earlier, it illustrates that there's significantly divergent interests between the Soviet Union and the Chinese already.
Well, the problem is, interestingly, it doesn't do that initially. You're ultimately,
but once the Chinese invade.
Right.
Yeah.
But initially, it creates this notion of reinforcing monolithic communism. It appears initially, when you read, a lot of the critiques of American diplomatic leadership, there are a lot of insiders who think, See, this shows it. They're making common cause. You know, North Korea never would have invaded if Stalin hadn't given them the go code. He said, go ahead and do it. We know Mao wanted it, right? But we also know that Mao wasn't terribly impressed with Stalin or with Soviet socialism. We also know that Stalin hated Chinese communism and didn't believe in it. Remember, he called them margarine communists, the idea that they hadn't gone through, as Marx required, they hadn't gone through that period of capitalism, which was the inevitable road to socialism. So that their revolution, in his eyes, wasn't authentic and was doomed to fail. But it succeeded. Remember, this is important because initially when we were talking about the Soviet Union's disposition toward China, they didn't necessarily want Mao to succeed, right? What did they want in China? And I'm speaking here between approximately 1945 and 1949. What did the Soviet Union want to see in China? McMahon spells this out. Sorry, Tristan, I'm sorry.
Disunity. They
wanted weakness. They wanted weakness because there's a 4,000 mile and more land barrier there that would be easier for them to defend, right? If they knew they had a more or less compliant regime on the other side of it. But it's clear that when Mao and the Chinese communists take power, that's not what they have. That's not what they have. Then here comes June 1950, in the summer of 1950, and North Korea invades South Korea. And it looks like initially, although later on, as Tristan suggested, we find out this wasn't necessarily the case, it looks to a lot of observers like, oh shit, look, they're doing it. They're making common cause against an ally of the United States, South Korea, right? They're sort of throwing down the gauntlet. They're globalizing the Cold War, okay? The other thing that's important from the point of view of internal pressures within the United States is that the invasion by north of South Korea in June reinforces forever Truman's conviction that he must now be guided by the principles of NSC 68, and that he's always been an ardent anti-communist, right? Now he knows he's got to really drop the hammer. Because this is, again, talking about internal pressures in the United States. It's important for us to remember when we look at the struggles over NSC 68, and May's chapter on that really outlines these quite well. It gives you kind of a nice chronology and gives you some of the key players. When you look at the people who Truman brought in when he was once he was elected in his own right, and he brings in Lewis Johnson in defense. And what's important about Lewis Johnson is he's not really a hawk. He's an anti-communist, but he's not really a hawk. He is installed, once he's confirmed, as defense secretary because he agrees with Truman that they need to start cutting costs. Why? Because the Democrats want to advance, for political purposes, the fair deal, right? This is a massive domestic program. Now, it's nothing like the New Deal, but it is to hold together the faltering tissues of the New Deal coalition, which is breaking apart largely because of cross-cutting pressures between, emerging demands from African Americans for civil rights and full emancipation and citizenship, along with the rejection of those same demands by white Southern Democrats. Okay, so the idea is, how do we hold this coalition together? One of the answers to that is the fair deal, right? Another part of that is, again, that there's still concern, having lived through the Depression, that if we don't get the rest of the world economy revved back up, and particularly the Western European economy, we'll be there again. And so in order to protect against that, to protect the American middle class, to preserve full employment, to improve living standards, to make education more accessible, oddly enough, a lot of the same kind of things that Democrats have started talking about again. In order to do that, this fair deal is important. In order to afford it, we've got to cut costs somewhere. Where are we going to cut them? The military. Paul Nitze, inside the State Department, and Dean Acheson, who comes in later as Secretary of State, oppose this. That becomes clear when you read NSC 68, because their argument is, we can't do that because the Soviets won't, because they don't believe they can, and they can't, not if they want to defeat us. But in order for us not only to contain them, but this becomes clear from a careful reading of NSC 68, By this time, Nitze is not talking, and his people, they're not talking about merely containing and being patient and vigilant with respect to communism. They're talking about rolling it back and ultimately eliminating it. Okay. In order to do that requires a massive military buildup. All right. That's one of the things I want you to notice when you go through that text, and I do want you to go through it. Another thing to note later on in NSC 68, there's a clear indication there that the American people are going to have to learn to do without. They're going to have to make some sacrifices. And we're talking about people who've made extraordinary sacrifices during the Depression, and even more in some ways, extraordinary sacrifices during the Second World War. And now you're going to be telling them again. You know, things like that Fair Deal and some of these social programs of the New Deal, you're going to have to let those go. How do you justify that? Well, you do it by painting an even larger threat, and that's going to be communism. Okay, so it's clear that the recipe being advocated by NSC 68 is much more thoroughgoing than anything Kennan ever envisioned. Remember that Kennan, both in the Long Telegram and the X article, emphasized educating the American people, explaining to the American people as adults, this is why we have to be vigilant toward the Soviet Union and skeptical of its actions and motives, right? Because of this contradictory system and the things that are motivating the Soviets. What Nitze and the NS68 study group are saying is, we got to get rid of them. And we got to convince the American people that you're going to have to make some sacrifices. Well, Truman was really reluctant to buy that argument until North Korea invaded South Korea. And in a sense, you could say it kind of gave him the cover to go forward with that, because you see very quickly, once the Korean War begins, Truman's sort of like, okay, I'm on board. And all of a sudden, how do you know? Look at defense budgets. What happens to defense budgets after the invasion of Korea? Yeah, they go up, as Patrick pointed, but was too shy to suggest. They explode. They absolutely explode. And they stay that way forever. We never backed away from that. We tried in the 90s, in the early 90s under H.W. Bush. Remember, we tried that idea of what was called the peace dividend. Clinton picked up on it a little bit. But what we realized was that this was military industrialism. We had invested so heavily in the military and in the proliferation of military facilities and military bases that if you start closing those things down, you're going to create an unemployment problem. I was living in California at the time, and we could see it. You know, we had become addicted to massive military spending. This begins, right, with the invasion of Korea and the adoption of NSC 68 and the posture of permanent military mobilization. Okay, so that when you're thinking about this, again, why do we globalize? Because of demonstration effect and because of the imperative of the United States to demonstrate that in every way possibly measurable, we are better than the Soviet Union. And part of that is we could stop them wherever they go militarily, them and their allies, wherever they go and whatever they do. Massive military buildup. Okay. And, we'll even distort the American economy in order to do that. And we'll distort it significantly. Till we get to the point when you look at American military expenditures, and then you factor in the cost of American wars, that is the deployment of combat troops abroad. And then you look at the interest that we pay on the debt that finances those. Something in the neighborhood of 40% of the American budget is absorbed by the military. That's extraordinary. That's really high, really high. Well, what anti-Soviets would say is, right, that was the price we had to pay. That was what it took, to defeat the Soviet Union. Never mind that we haven't really backed off of that very much since then. But that was what it took. So when you're looking through that stretch of time from approximately the invocation of the Truman Doctrine through to the beginning of the implementation of NSC 68 and the rise of military industrialism, what I want you to think about is not only, okay, how did this affect the rest of the world? McMahon spells that out pretty carefully, right? but what was motivating it. And a lot of that was what was happening internally, both in terms of the sources of resistance and the sources advocating this massive militarization of the American political economy. And the ones advocating militarization won, and they won overwhelmingly. And the May chapter kind of explains how that happened. One of the things to notice in NSC 68 in terms of the language is, and I've referred to it a couple times now as apocalyptic. I want to get you to think about, what I mean by that. These are little excerpts taken from NSC 68, right? Now this is on page 8. We're describing the Soviet Union, and remember, the audience for this is the President of the United States, okay? The Soviet Union, unlike previous aspirants to hegemony, is animated by a new fanatic faith, antithetical to our own, and seeks to impose its absolute authority over the rest of the world. Now, think of that in the context of what Kennan was writing about the Soviet perception of us, right? It's a remarkably similar perspective. Kennan is saying they don't believe these two systems can coexist. What Nitze and the NS68 study group are saying is they can't. So they're sharing the same conviction as the Soviet Union that Kennan warned about, all right? Seeks to impose its absolute authority over the rest of the world. Hold that thought. Conflict has therefore become endemic and is waged on the part of the Soviet Union by violent or non-violent methods in accordance with the dictates of expediency. Why did we go to Vietnam? Now you might say, but that was a reaction to the Soviet Union. Soviet Union didn't invade Vietnam. The idea here is that you're seeing this language, this hyperbolic language, and it becomes increasingly sort of almost Old Testament biblical in a way. The issues that face us are momentous, involving the fulfillment or destruction not only of this republic, meaning the United States, but of civilization itself. That's biblical. Okay, this is important because you got to remember who the audience is for this, right? They are issues which will not await our deliberations. With conscience and resolution, this government and the people it represents must now take new and fateful decisions. In other words, you got to do something now, Mr. President. No more waiting, no more hemming and hawing. This is, the crisis is here, it's now, and you have to do something. Remember, this is drafted before the invasion of Korea, okay? I would refer you, when you're looking at pages 9 through 10, for example, this is just looking at the early part of it to get the tone of it. The outline of the fundamental design and the contrast that's drawn between the United States and the USSR is really striking. And when you read May's article, and he talks about the kind of language and the kind of florid sledgehammer rhetoric that Nitze and his people use, you'll see it, and you'll see it right away. There's this constant contrasting of freedom and slavery, right? Which is interesting because, of course, what's left out of that, even though they paraphrase from the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and everything else, they fail to mention that the American public was built on slavery, right? They really conveniently omit that, along with a lot of other things. But it is that idea of this, it's the Soviet Union is a slave state, and we represent freedom again and again and again and again and again. It almost sounds like coloring book American history. It's not a terribly sophisticated argument. It's pretty blunt, and it's pretty hyperbolic. And it's important that this is an official communique intended for the eyes of the President of the United States, okay? And there's this notion of the United States in terms of what's motivating us and what we represent to the rest of the world, demonstration effect, a market for free trade in ideas without any compulsion to bring all societies into conformity with it. Okay, but that same document later on, they talk about a world society based on consent. Consent to what? If, the framework is already, we have assumed, however reluctantly, world leadership. In other words, they want world dominion. We've already achieved world leadership. That's world dominion. Well, I just want you to look at the tensions that are struck here, and sometimes the kind of ironic inconsistencies of saying, on the one hand, the last thing that we would want to see anybody, dominate the world. Of course, we've been compelled. In fact, we've been invited to do the same thing, because that's really what they're saying, right? And so when you're reading through these things, the entire document revisits again and again and again this contrast between freedom and slavery and the imperative of the Soviet Union to rule the world, while at the same time invoking our inevitable and necessary leadership of the world in order to emancipate it. So you can see that, there's an ideological struggle underway here. And the audience for this is not the Soviet Union. And the audience for this, by the way, is not even the American people. This was classified, and it wasn't declassified until, in a fragmentary sense, the late 1970s. It was never intended for popular consumption. The audience is an audience of one. It's the President of the United States, right? And so this is why the Cold War globalizes, because the overwhelming conviction of both sides of leadership is this is not something that can be contained to just tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. This is about what the world's going to look like forever, okay? And that's important. Now, the last thing I wanted to mention, since no one feels like talking today, we don't know a lot specifically about what's going on in the Soviet Union, but there is one thing that isn't really clearly articulated in McMahon, because it is an overview that I thought I'd spend a little time, talking about. Before I do that, does anybody have any questions, observations, thoughts, or anything else on anything I've talked about so far? As I pour more coffee, because coffee emancipates the world. Of course it doesn't.
I understand that Kennan's point, like, he wasn't agitating for military action and was obviously against that, but I find it surprising. I mean, I know there's a lot of external factors, but it's just always, every time I read anything in this class, it's just striking that there wasn't a bigger war lobby, especially considering, you take Eisenhower's industrial military complex speech at the end of his term in office, and I mean, they just have an opportunity to speed that up by 2 decades. All of that money, I don't see why it didn't happen this time.
Well, what I'm suggesting is it did, and the genesis of it was the construction and ratification, in a sense, before presentation to president, of NSC 68. That this is where, and this is what May is suggesting. If you want to find out what the genesis of military industrialism is, look at the process through which NSC 68 was drafted and then presented and justified to the president, and then combine that with what happened with the invasion of South Korea, and all of a sudden, we just didn't stop. And you're right, it triggered that quickly. Because the other thing that's happening when we look at this globally is around the world, we're seeing this emergence of nationalist movements, anti-colonial movements, the breakup of old empires and colonial possessions. All of this is creating instability. Instability creates unpredictability. The desire on both sides here, the Soviet Union and the United States, is to somehow normalize things to the point where we can make planning decisions, and that requires predictability. We have to respond to these emerging outbreaks of desires for freedom and emancipation and sovereign, autonomy and things like that. We've declared as much in the UN Charter. And so we've declared that in the Truman Doctrine. When people are aspiring to be free, we're going to support that. Well, you can't say that and then say, but, really, we're not going to build up our military and we're going to do cost cutting and pass the fair deal. It isn't going to pass muster, especially after the invasion of South Korea. But also, it's about this time that the French really begin to stagger in Vietnam and throughout Southeast Asia, that there are all these nationalist movements, not only in Vietnam, but also in Laos. which threatens Cambodia, which threatens, Thailand, right? Which are more or less American allies or Western allies, or trying desperately to remain neutral. So there's this chronic instability there. There is similarly chronic instability with the breakup of imperial colonial possessions in sub-Saharan Africa. There's continued instability in the new nation formation with the independence of Pakistan, that the whole notion of partition and the independence of Pakistan and India. Okay, those are problematic periods of time. And so we go from this real concern to recover from the Depression and the Second World War and enjoy this new affluence that's being visited upon us, but also, as we pointed out, real concerns about the rest of the world's got to catch up and get moving here, because if they don't, this won't continue. This middle class we've built up, all this affluence we're enjoying and everything else can be compromised. That was the justification, remember, for the internal passage of congressional support for what became known as the Marshall Plan. Increasingly, then, we see the importance of people leaning more toward the development of the military. But even that, it's not that there wasn't a war lobby. The lack of consensus was on what the military should look like. And in particular, how much of our military obligations can be met by not only strategic, but tactical nuclear weapons. And that becomes the big debate in the late 50s and into the 1960s is, with respect to American military posture, nuclear weapons, and this is one of the things Eisenhower felt pretty strongly, nuclear weapons were a cheap alternative to putting American personnel in the field in conventional war. Also, Paul Nitze is a key actor here and remains so at least into the 1980s, right? And he, because of the work he did in the survey report that was done on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he begins to believe in the feasibility of deploying nuclear weapons as field operative tactical weapons. He doesn't see that nuclear war cannot have a winner. He believes in the tactical utility of nuclear weapons. That part of that, what you're calling war lobby, was always there. And they had a period of time under Eisenhower where they were really kind of given free rein. The development of massive retaliation and things like that, the development of mutual assured destruction, the notion of the new look, all of these different postures of the military are fractions within the military or war establishment as to what the proper disposition of the American military should be, what the American military posture should look like. And the key to that was not only naval assets, which were important, but strategic bombers and later ICBMs and the production of nuclear warheads. That continues all the way well into the Reagan years and the end of the Cold War. Okay, does that make any sense, Brett?
Yes, it does. I mean, there's many rabbit holes to go down there, but I think that's enough for today.
Yeah, there are, and that's the problem. And again, this is why, with respect to the research assignment that I want you to do, the brief research that you do to satisfy the final assignment here, that might be a thing you want to take a look at. What were the internal struggles with respect to the remilitarization after the Second World War? And I don't think you can leave these national security documents out of that. I think you have to look at the Cold War, containment, the development of thermonuclear weapons, the acquisition of those weapons by the Soviet Union, and then, of course, later the proliferation of those weapons. That becomes a key underpinning of the globalization of the Cold War, nuclear proliferation, or attempts to prevent that. Okay. Now, the last thing I wanted to touch on today is, again, not covered really very comprehensively in McMahon, is what was going on inside the Soviet Union. Okay. Just as there were fractions politically within the United States, as between Democrats and Republicans, but also between hawks and doves and within the military over the proper disposition of the military that Brett points out. Within the Soviet Union, and I hinted at this a little earlier, there was retained this influence of the Stalinists who supported the massive police state of the Soviet Union, and a lot of the really violent and brutal purges of the Soviet people. Never mind what was happening outside the Soviet Union. These were internal repressive measures that were justified as necessary in consolidating the revolution. One of the ways of thinking about this was, in the mind of the Stalinists, the revolution was over. This was about consolidating the power of the Soviet Union. And this is important because from this point of view, the ideological motivation of the Soviet Union was much less about propagating a global socialist or communist revolution, and much more about merely expanding both the security interests and the global reach of the Soviet Union as an imperial power, okay? But there was also this vestige of the old Marxist-Leninists, okay? And they were the people who opposed, although they didn't dare say anything in most cases, they opposed, the expansion of the police state and the security forces, and, the propensity of Stalinists to create this culture of paranoia where people were informing on their neighbors and their family members and all this kind of stuff. They saw that as destructive of the revolutionary potential of Soviet socialism. And they didn't like it and they didn't support it. They just had no outlet of resistance, right? Okay. This has a sort of flashpoint with an attempt by Stalin shortly before his death to engineer another major purge, sometimes called the doctor's purge. Again, if you're interested in doing research, there's been some interesting research done on the purges of the 1930s and then real concern within the Soviet Union about Stalin's efforts to impose another such surge. And it's often referred to as the doctor's purge. I don't want to go into that because it would take us forever. And I can sense in the virtual room here that you're running out of steam, and that's okay. We've covered a lot of material. But there was resistance to that, okay? This leads up to, of course, in 1953, the death of Stalin. This is important because it's one of the first major international events of the new Eisenhower administration. We have the denouement of the Korean War, but then we have the death of Stalin. The death of Stalin is important because it creates power vacuum within the Soviet Union, much of which is opaque to the rest of the world, including the American foreign policy establishment. But what we do know was going on behind that was a kind of rivalry between Georgy Melenkov, who was kind of supposed to be the one who was going to become the new Stalin, right? And this other guy by the name of Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev, in terms of his ideological orientation, is often associated with the kind of Leninist notion of, the notion of continuing the revolutionary struggle and things like this. But when Stalin came to power, Khrushchev retained and gathered more of his own power by becoming a kind of lockstep loyalist to Stalin. In that sense, he was extremely pragmatic. He also, in a very brutal and dangerous world, was a survivor. So although Khrushchev often comes off as being kind of blunt-fingered and kind of crude and kind of unsophisticated and naive, he wasn't stupid. He was incredibly shrewd, and there was a lot of Machiavelli in him. He understood which way the wind was blowing, and he knew how to tack with that wind to gain advantage for himself. Okay, and so what happens is, in the immediate aftermath of Stalin's death, Khrushchev is one among a number of people, and they engineer, they create this, it's a secretariat, and it's these five aspirants to power, the key to whom was Khrushchev himself. And then between 1953 and 1956, Stalin is gradually elbowing himself into more and more and more authority. One of the things that he has to do in order to make a big leap forward in terms of his ability to exert power over the Soviet Union is to denounce Stalin, okay? The idea being break that cult of personality that was prohibiting anyone from succeeding Stalin and engaging in their own direction for the Soviet Union, which Khrushchev clearly wanted to do. And so in February of 1956, Stalin delivers the so-called secret speech. And this is the speech in which Stalin denounces, in which Khrushchev denounces Stalin, pinpoints a lot of the brutality of the Stalinist regime. Now, this is important, though. This is a common misunderstanding. He doesn't really talk about the brutality of the secret police, and he doesn't really talk about a lot of the oppressive and brutal, measures of the Soviet regime against its own people. He talks about the harm done to the Soviet Communist Party, right, in the purges and things like that. And he denounces all of that by way of trying to break the cult of personality and allow people like himself to ascend within the communist hierarchy. Remember, this is not something that's presented for the general consumption of the Soviet people. This is intended only for the elite Soviet leadership. And it's not until the 1980s, really, that we get anything like the full text of this speech. It remained secret that long, okay? More than 30 years, okay? As a consequence of this, he becomes the general secretary of the Communist Party in 53. He delivers the speech in 56. By 1958, he is officially the premier of the Soviet Union. He has muscled himself into power by exploiting the fractions within the Soviet Communist Party and trying to sort of resolve some of those institutional contradictions, to repair some of the gaps in ideological integrity of Soviet socialism. And one of the things that's striking that he does is to invoke what Nietzsche and a lot of the other hardliners thought impossible: peaceful coexistence. He starts using the language, particularly by the time he is Soviet premier, of peaceful coexistence. He first invokes this just after the secret speech, at least, right? And so the idea is he's trying to resolve and kind of clean up the mess of Stalinism and allow the Soviet Union to reconsolidate and redirect its power. Because remember that McMahon mentions this several times. Historically, the Soviet Union pokes and prods the West, and especially the United States, until it's faced with direct confrontation, and then reflexively it backs off, right? And Khrushchev understands this. And so what he's trying to do is, in a sense, he's not trying to concede to Western capitalism. He's trying to normalize the relationship, because his belief is very similar in some ways to the belief of many in the West, which is that ultimately, using the third world in particular, the developing world in particular, and that demonstration effect of Soviet socialism, we will demonstrate the superiority of our way of life and our model of how to do things and our economic system and our planned economy and command economy and all that. We'll show our superiority, and the example will be proliferated in a widespread way in the developing world. We will keep them from falling into the orbit of the West. And we will do that by appearing to be a power for peace rather than confrontation. We will paint the United States as the belligerent and as the power of, the advocator of the power of war rather than of peace. All right. This is important because it gives an ideological premise to global Soviet efforts, particularly in the developing world. We represent peace. We're fighting against violent Western imperialism. And it plays very well in much of the developing world, okay? So that, this is a consequence of a kind of shift in Soviet policy, the genesis of which is an attempt to resolve the internal contradictions within the Soviet Union rather than between the Soviet Union and the United States. Does that make sense? Again, it's hard to get that without doing that kind of Sovietology that I'm not trained in. But this was it was a period of time that's always interested me, and I've just, you can't do everything. But for those of you who might be interested, there is something in that power struggle within the Soviet Union. And some historians of the Soviet Union there have been some articles written about it, and they're in a constant state of revision the more that material is revealed. We have new things that we learn when more of the old Soviet era documents are released, right? And then they have to be translated in many cases, and then they have to be vetted for the idea of their plausibility. Are these liable to be accurate, or are they just old fragments of ideological discourse that we really can't lean into very much? And we're still in that era of scholarship. So again, the point of today's discussion is, yes, the chapter is about globalization of the Cold War. You know, the waterfront is covered by McMahon. He does it very well. What I'm trying to suggest is why that occurred as a consequence of internal pressures in both the Soviet Union and the United States, and to some degree within the West, and also the emerging, the emerging world, the emerging world of these newly independent countries and the so-called developing world. They have internal pressures of their own. How do we justify this nationalist struggle? In Laos, for example, how do we, take a country where there has never been any national unity, where there's a lot of ethnic strife and a lot of hostility? How do we unify these people? How do we give a largely peasant economy a sense of national identity that they've never had? Soviet socialism was looked at a way to do that. Clearly, that is what Ho was doing in Vietnam. His influence was profound on neighboring Laos, and we see that in the creation of the Pathet Lao, modeled after the Viet Minh and then the Viet Cong, and their ultimate success, largely as a consequence of the success of North Vietnam in Southeast Asia. Okay. Those are driven by internal demands. This, you can't understand Southeast Asia merely by looking at what did the Soviet Union want and what did the United States want. It's too easy to leave out, well, what did the people of Laos want? What did the people of Vietnam want? What did the Cambodians want? What did Thailand want? What did Burma want? Those are important things. These internal political and social pressures can't be, shouldn't be, cannot be ignored, even when you're looking at a global phenomenon like the Cold War. So I hope that makes sense, and I hope you find it useful. So what I'm going to be looking forward to this weekend is looking at your article reviews, right? The deadline is when? Can I get a witness? Friday at 11 p.m. All right, and that gives me the weekend to look over them, and then we'll discuss them in the following week's class. And then after that, I'll go through and I'll vet them again, because I'll make notes as we're talking about them. Then I will grade them. Then I will post those grades, and you'll know how you did if you're concerned about your grade. Are there any other questions or comments or concerns about the specific material of McMahon or anything else that we've covered? A lot of material, but I'm trying to reinforce the idea of there's a richer way to look at this. Okay, we've been going for a long time. I know everybody's tired. I apologize again for moving us to Zoom. I just thought that under the circumstances, it was the best way to kind of keep everybody more or less safe and comfortable that, you're less likely to get sick. We will resume hostilities in the classroom next week, okay? All right, so I'll see you in class next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.